In this lecture, I look at what the idea of multivocal symbols can tell us in relation to a form of ritual meal practiced in Java called the Slametan. I'm going to base this around the question of what does the Slametan mean for Muslims in Banyuwangi, and Banyuwangi is one of my field sites. So in order to do this, I'm going to introduce the idea of symbols, rituals and myths, and then I'm going to look at Banyuwangi and then also the Slametan. I'm going to look at the different theoretical interpretations by Geertz, by Woodward and Beattie, and then I'll finish that with some comments on my own impressions about the Slametan in Banyuwangi. So in this course of lectures on symbols and signs, I'm looking at different aspects of symbols, and you could think of symbols as being static things like the Virgin Mary, but it can also be part of a myth. So if we think of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which I looked at in the first lecture on multivocality, there's a myth about how an Indian named Juan Diego saw an apparition of the Virgin Mary. And then symbols can also be put into action by us. We do rituals, like for example, if you do a pilgrimage or go through pilgrimage to Guadalupe, to the church or the basilica there, and pray to it, you're going through ritual movements. So in other words, there's symbols you can look at in isolation, just look at like an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, but you can also understand them in the context of a story or a myth, and you can also understand them in how we put them into action through ritual. So this lecture I'm going to look at a ritual, basically, so symbols in action, and I'm going to look at a kind of ritual that involves a meal, and meals are one of the most common ways of holding a ritual throughout the world. I'm going to show how the symbolism of these ritual meals, known as Slametan, can be analysed as multivocal. So I'm going to be arguing this in relation to Banyuwangi, my fieldwork location. Just to skip back here, there is the world. If you skip down to here, get Indonesia. Let's expand Indonesia to here. And if we go to the middle of Indonesia to Java, and we expand that, we get to East Java. And this is East Java here, and Banyuwangi is in the far east of Java, right next to the famous holiday resort island of Bali. So when I did fieldwork, the population was about 1.5 million. There was Oseng, which is like the local indigenous people, and then there are migrants who've come from the rest of Java, who are known as Javanese in English, and also from the island of Madura, who came down here. So the economy is largely based around agriculture, particularly rice farming. The area around here is what's known as one of East Java's rice baskets. There's also fishing. The seas are very fertile with all the volcanic runoff into the ocean. There's also a lot of labour migrating over to Bali to work in tourism and tourism-related industries there, and also to the East Javanese capital of Surabaya, and to the capital of Indonesia, Jakarta, to do work too. And importantly for this presentation, the religion is at 95% Muslim. So if we look at this as Banyuwangi, where I did field work, and we can expand it over here, I did field work right in this green area here. So Banyuwangi itself, like most of, well, like all of Southeast Asia actually, we think had an initial period of animistic beliefs. So the original people who came down to Southeast Asia were first of all what we call the Australo-Melanesian people. They came down probably about 40,000 years ago and spread through to Australia, and you can still find their descendants. You know, the indigenous people of Australia, Melanesians, for example, in Papua New Guinea, the descendants of these Australo-Melanesians. They're mostly now in isolated corners of Southeast Asia and don't exist at all in Banyuwangi because they've been displaced by the next large migrations. One of the great recent migrations of people, the migration of the Austronesian people, who migrated from Taiwan down to Southeast Asia through the Pacific, New Zealand and Hawaii, and east and west to Madagascar, the Malagasy people. So Austronesians brought their own kind of religious beliefs around about the time of Christ, but earlier too, to Southeast Asia. And we think their beliefs were animistic. They sort of believed in, for example, local spirits. The trees would have maybe a large, what's called a banyan tree might have spirits in it. The local stream might have spirits in it too. So this is what anthropologists call animism, the belief that spirits or souls animate things like non-human things like trees, stones, and so on. And some evidence of this are what are called dolmen. These are probably, I'm not sure exactly what they were used for. I think the archaeologists are saying they might have been sort of grave sites. And you can see some of them just over the border from Banyuwangi. But there's not much evidence, like archaeological evidence, of this sort of first wave of, if you like, animistic belief. Now, what happens subsequently is that firstly you get Hindu Buddhism spreading through Southeast Asia. This occurs sometime in the Common Era, that is, sometime after Christ. We get Hinduism and Buddhism spreading all the way from India and Sri Lanka through Thailand and across to Malaysia and even far-flung places like parts of the Philippines. Now this spreads through the region, probably in the first 1,000 years, say year 0 to year 1,000. It actually reaches Banyuwangi a bit later because it's kind of like a far-flung part of Java. So the influence of Hindu Buddhism only arrived there later than most other parts of Java. In fact, it sort of was one of the sort of remnant or last places in Java that remained Islamic, because Islam starts to spread from about the year 1000 and really picks up pace in Southeast Asia from about 1400 or 1500. So merchants are bringing Islam. Before merchants were brought, merchants from India brought Hinduism and Buddhism, but then probably from the year 1000 on, and particularly from about 1400, 1500 on, they're bringing Islam to Southeast Asia. And during that period, most of Java converts to being Islamic, or at least in theory or in name, whereas Banyuwangi, which was called Balambangan, remains Hindu-Buddhist. And actually, interestingly enough, what changed Banyuwangi to become Hindu-Buddhist like the rest of Java was the Dutch. The Dutch conquered, if you like, Banyuwangi in the 1760s and 1770s, and they actually promoted Islam because at that time they were in control of most of what they needed to be in control of in Java, and they wanted to fight against the Balinese Hindu Buddhists. Well, they were mostly Hindus by this stage, Balinese Hindus. So they promoted in Far East Java Islam as a way to counter the influence of the Balinese Hindus. And that's really the start of the spread of Islam in this far-flung corner of Java from the Dutch. So that's the context in which I'm going to talk about my fieldwork. We have, it's an old-fashioned model, but the model is of like an animistic base. Animism of Southeast Asia, there's animistic base, and then on top of that you have Hindu Buddhism, and then on top of that you have a kind of traditional Islam which spreads from about 1500. So just to repeat, at the bottom is a kind of animistic animism, which is pre-world religion, and then the arrival of the world religions in Indonesia, it's Hinduism and Buddhism, and then after that Hinduism and Buddhism gets for the most part displaced in Java, at least, by Islam, and other parts like eastern Indonesia and the Philippines, eventually by forms of Christianity such as Catholicism and Protestantism. So today I'm going to be talking about the Slametan, which is a small ritual based around the home. Basically, as Geertz says, the people who are invited are friends, neighbours, fellow workers, relatives, local spirits, dead ancestors, and near forgotten gods. So, as in my experience, which is a little bit different, a host would invite his neighbours, family, and friends. So we celebrate, for example, a child's birthday to ensure the successful sale of land, or to farewell a nephew who's come to visit from the city. So he has, in local terms, you will call it a hajat, an intention or a will, which is very important to mark the occasion and to make it propitious, to make it successful and lucky. So the guest wives, the host and guest wives, prepare the meal. So it's a bit different to the way, for example, in Australia, if you host a ritual like a barbecue, or not so much a barbecue, actually people like a barbecue where everybody's expected to bring something. But the difference here is that everybody cooks it together, all the wives cook it together. And the wives cook during the day, and then in the evening the men gather around and sit around. And it's normally just after evening prayers you rush over to where the Selamatan is being held. So here I am with a local Modin who's like a religious specialist, and a Kiai, he's like a religious scholar. And at the Slametan you recite passages from the Quran, then you quickly eat the meal. You don't sort of labour over it like in the Western context where a good meal should last, a banquet should last for hours. You should really eat it very quickly. You share cigarettes and share a bit of a joke, and then you leave. At the longest, the Slametan would last for about an hour, but probably half an hour would be ideal as I remember it. And the men, because you don't want to be greedy or be sort of you want to have restraint and control. You don't sort of eat second helpings or anything. You just eat what's on your plate, which means, or not even finish it, or the meal that's in the middle. You can see actually in the corner here, his banana leaf with a bit of rice on it, just the corner of the rice that you can see. And that's left, and then the wives who cook the meal come and eat the leftovers, take the leftovers away. So there are different elements of the Slametan, and it's what Maus, for example, would call a total social phenomenon, which means it's a social phenomenon or social happening or occurrence or thing which incorporates all elements of the society. There's an economic element, there's a sharing of food. The men eat the food in the ritual context, and labour, the wives labour for the food. There's a social aspect to it. All the neighbours are invited without regard to rank, affiliation, or religious outlook. So there's a sense of equality. There's a sort of egalitarian ethos that's associated with the Slametan. And there's an ideological element. The prayers are offered, prayers to God, and blessings are provided for the child or the person who's trying to sell their land or whatever it is. So how are we to understand the symbolism that's going on in the meal? The classic exposition of the Slametan is from a guy called Clifford Geertz, one of the most famous anthropologists of the 20th century. And he described Javanese religion as being a syncretic form of Islam. And syncretic means a blending of local beliefs with the New World religion. So what Geertz says is that Islam in Java blends that sort of animistic base, if you like, the animism of the pre-historic period, and then in the historic period, the Hindu-Buddhist beliefs and also the Islamic beliefs. And all of these beliefs, he says, are blended in Javanese religion. And more than any other ritual, they're blended in the Slametan. And he saw three kind of variants of Javanese religion. The syncretic Islam had three variants. And he said these were related to sort of what he called a socio-cultural nucleus and religious outlook, which I'll explain now. He said there was an abangan, or peasant variety, and this was a variety of religion of the peasants and people whose socio-cultural nucleus, whose social life and cultural life was based around the village, and you might say the household. And in their religion, Geertz saw a balanced integration of animistic, Hinduistic, and we could say Hindu-Buddhist, actually, Hindu-Buddhist and Islamic elements. So theirs is the most truly syncretic if you like, stream, or aliran as he called it. Then there's the Santri, who are the traders, and their social life and their cultural life is based around the market. And their religion was, he said, is a purer Islam, less contaminated with either animism of the prehistoric times or the mysticism associated with Hinduism and Buddhism. And then there's the, oh, what happened there? The lecture's over. Goodbye. No, I'll go back. There's the Priyayi. These were the old aristocracy, if you like, and their economy, when Geertz was doing research in the 1950s, was based around the civil service. They were the civil servants who had been educated by the Dutch during the colonial era, and then in independent Indonesia that Geertz was doing research in, they became the civil servants. So their social structural nucleus, their social life and their cultural life was based around the bureaucracy. And their religion was one of etiquette, art and mystical practice. So it was most strongly influenced by the Hindu-Buddhist elements. So if you had to sum it up, there's the Abangan, the peasants who balance all the elements. There are the Santri, who emphasize the Islamic elements, and they're the traders. And there's the Priyayi, the civil servants, who used to be the aristocracy, and who emphasize the Hindu-Buddhist mystical elements within this Javanese religion. So for him, the Slametan is the core ritual in that part of society in Multivocality. That's the famous place he did research in, now known as Pare. The core ritual in that part of society in Multivocality in which the Abangan worldview is most prominent. So you can see the Abangan syncretism more than anything else. He said it's syncretic like Javanese religion itself, and religious traditions are blended into the ritual, and as I mentioned, those invited from within a short distance of one house. And the main thing, the word Selamatan, and it's spelled differently, sometimes without an E there, is that everything is Slamet. Slamet means, if you think, goes back to, I suppose, to Hebrew shalom, or Arabic salam, or salam, which means everything's in a state of peace, goodwill. I can't really explain or translate it. I think you might know it just by, something like peace and goodwill might be the expression, and free of hindrances or disturbances or anything excessive. That would be something like Slamet. So what does the Slametan symbolize? Here it says it symbolizes the mystic and social unity of those participating in it. It's a way of symbolizing the egalitarian connection of all these people in relation to their God, and if they're emphasizing this, the spirits or the ancestors. Now, the model, it's hard to, even explaining it now, the alarm bells are screaming in my head because there are so many problems with Geertz's model. It's been revised by many different authors, his idea of three kinds of, or three strains of aliran in Javanese culture. The first revision is that Geertz sort of presented an ideal model. He emphasized culture over economy. He sort of said, well, what's most important in this society is their religious outlook. Marxist scholars say actually the most important thing is class, and from class religious culture emerges. That's the first revision. The second revision is most people don't think that Priyayi really represents a special religious culture that's all that different from Abangan. Not most people. Some people say that Priyayi is not a special religious culture. It's just a class of people in the 1950s, and probably today it's a very small class. As far as the model of religion, other scholars said, look, what he's talking about is just the experience of a place. This place he calls Multivocality, and he says that now things are people say, well, now what's more important is regional variation. If you go to West Java or East Java, and not Central Java where he did his field work, you'll find different things. And then if you go further afield to Sumatra or Borneo, you'll see different things too. So we should look at the difference between areas more than assuming this is just the one model for all of Java or Indonesia, worse still. Another critique comes from historians who say, look, all Geertz was writing about was a very specific corner of Java and a very specific result of certain politics that were occurring in the 1950s in the town he did research in, and we can't really read too much into it. Another revision is people say, well, there's really only two kinds of Islam in Java. There's a Santri Islam, the pure Islamic one, and then there's a kind of what people call Javanist or Kejawen, or a kind of Islam that's a Javanese Islam. So a Javanese Islam and a pure Islam. Another revision is that people say, look, it's really a continuum between the three kinds, or two kinds, whatever, however many aliran streams or variants you want. So they're not discrete types. Now, Geertz explicitly said they are discrete and separate types. A further revision is that the critique of Geertz was that the mysticism of Javanese Islam does not refer to the Hindu-Buddhist past of Java, but actually is Sufism. It's an expression of the Sufistic, if you like, the Sufism, who are the Javanese mystics, the Javanese mystical trend, the Islamic mystical trend reached Java, and that's the explanation for the mystical trend in Java. It's not because of the Hindu-Buddhist past. Finally, more recently, there's been a revision to say, look, the two kinds of Islam that are important in Java are civil Islam and regimist Islam. Civil Islam is a kind of Islam that is liberal and accepts different opinions and different ways of being Islamic, and regimist Islam is pushing for an Islamic state. So the result of these 8 complicated, and perhaps it wasn't even worth mentioning them all in such detail, brief as it was, the result of this is most people accept that there are two kinds of Islam. There's a kind of a more mystical Islam, which has different words like Javanist or Kejawen, and a less mystical, purer point, which is Santri Islam. And this is a starting point for 2 subsequent scholars, namely Woodward and Beattie. Woodward talks about 2 streams, Santri and Kejawen. The Kejawen is more influenced by mystical Islam or Sufism than by pre-Islamic elements such as Hindu Buddhism. I'll just explain that. Actually, that's the same point as number 7 on this slide. And he says the distinction between Javanese Islam and Santri Islam is not a distinction between Orthodox and Syncretist Islam. Rather, it's a distinction between legalistic and mystical interpretations of Islam. So people who believe you can come to the truth of Islam through following the Quran and the Hadith very carefully and reading the words literally, and mystical forms are like you can come to the truth of Islam by engaging in practices like listening to music and dancing or meditating. So that's, he says, is the most important distinction. Geertz describes the Slametan as an animistic ritual with Islam tacked on, Woodward says. And he sees it as a locally defined Islamic rite. So local people have defined Islam on their own terms, as a synthesis, or as, in other words, as syncretism. But Woodward says, look, the Slametan isn't really a Javanese local interpretation of Islam. It's actually essentially an Islamic kind of ritual. Okay, moving on to Beattie. Beattie has another form of a practical Islam in Bayou. He says Bayou, which is the same district I did fieldwork in, up here in Galaga. He says that you should talk about the Islam in Java as being a practical Islam, and there are 2 kinds of this practical Islam: that which is upheld by the Santri, the sort of purist Geertz's traders, purist traders, and the Abangan or the Javanists, the mystical types. And he asks himself, well, how do these 2 kinds of people get along with each other? He gives the example of the red and white porridge that is held in the Slametan, the ritual meal. And we can see red and white porridge here, the bubur, as it's called. And now when this is served a ritual meal, the Santri can say, oh, the red and white symbolize Adam and Eve. By contrast, the mystical ones, the mystical people who are attending this egalitarian ritual, because they've been invited as well, both kinds have been invited, they say, yeah, it symbolizes Adam and Eve, but that's not the end of it. Adam and Eve are just sort of like intermediaries and a way to a higher mystical awareness of the oneness of the universe. Now, for the Santri, that extra bit is offensive. And for the Javanists, it's a bit offensive to say it's just about Adam and Eve. So they can all get along and say something like, more or less, it's about Adam and Eve, and leave it like that. And what that means is a symbol is multivocal. It can mean different things to different people. So he says the symbols are ambiguous or vague. So privately, people can interpret the symbolic meaning of different rituals in their own way. And thus, publicly, the Santri and Abangan, the more legalistic and the more mystical proponents of this practical Islam, can brush over their difference. So for BT, the Slametan symbolizes different things to different people, but the basic principle is agreeing to differ. That the Slametan is basically about agreeing to differ. And you can actually see in this version of this wonderful book, Varieties of Javanese Religion, men sitting around a Slametan, which looks like quite a delicious meal, but I shouldn't say that because that's not the point. Okay, I've sort of taken issue with BT on one point. He talks about a variety of Islamic practice in Banyuwangi and sort of extends that to the rest of Java, but I think that actually Bayu is quite unique, and Bayu in several villages around where he did field work. And that rather than variety, the main picture is conformity. So there isn't that much need in my mind to brush over the differences, but that's just a small point, and you can follow it up if you Google my name and maybe, what was the name of the article? Oh, it was a chapter in a book. Anyway, the main point, which is still important, is the multivocality of the symbolism, and this is the point that BT makes, that different people can attend the ritual and take away different meanings from it, so that everybody can continue this egalitarian ritual of the Slametan. For Orthodox Muslims, they can continue to observe what they believe is their Islamic orthodoxy, and at the same time, blessings and food are given and reciprocated by the participants in the ritual meal. And through it, there's a symbolism of unity and cohesion. So in summary, the lecture was about multivocality. The idea is that different symbols can mean different things to different people. We saw that in relation to the Virgin of Guadalupe, where the Virgin means different things to Mexicans, where it meant the death of Christ and the death of the Father and the struggle against authoritarian control, or for the disinherited, where it sort of referred to the biblical prophecy of the promised land, or for the Indian people who it represented Tonantzin and the old goddesses. So again, you have here multivocality, symbols meaning different things. And I think you'll find the idea of multivocality is useful for understanding other symbols too. Thank you very much.